Welcome. My name is Sabine Roser, and I am a professor of ethics at TU Delft. In my research, I focus on risk and moral emotions. In modern society, we are confronted with risks every day. These range from natural disasters to industrial incidents, from terrorism to violent crime. These risks often give rise to heated emotional public debates. What is interesting in these debates is that typically there's a difference in the perception of risk between scientific experts and policymakers on the one hand, and the general public on the other. While experts tend to rely on scientific studies that point to the supposedly low probability of risks, the public is often concerned about the concrete impact of such risks on their day-to-day lives. Experts and policymakers often emphasize that the worries of the public are due to a lack of understanding of risks. Experts usually assess risk with cost-benefit analysis and formal methods, such as a calculation of risk as probability times impact. However, as social scientists, psychologists, and philosophers have pointed out, assessing risk is not a purely scientific and mathematical endeavor. Risk also involves ethical aspects. There's a strong consensus amongst risk scholars from philosophy and the social sciences that ethical considerations should be included in a risk assessment. Indeed, as psychologist Paul Slovic has shown, such ethical considerations do figure in the general public's perception of risk. However, such considerations are excluded from the quantitatively oriented approach to risk used by experts and policymakers. Thus, risk scholars have argued that the general public has a different, but equally legitimate rationality compared to experts. As such, they argue that the general public should be included in decision-making about risk. There are also studies by Paul Slovic and others that show that emotions play an important role in the risk perceptions of the general public. Social scientists struggle with how to deal with this, as emotions are usually seen to be irrational. This threatens to undermine the idea that the general public might employ an alternative, legitimate rationality concerning risks. However, the question is whether emotions are by definition opposed to rationality. Many emotion scholars emphasize that emotions can also be a source of knowledge and practical insight. The neuropsychologist Antonio Damasio has famously shown in his research that without emotions, we cannot be rational in practical contexts. Damasio's studies show that people with damage to a part of their brain called the amygdala lose the capacity to have emotions. Damasio found that these people tend to lose their capacity to make moral and practical judgments, as well as reasonable risk judgments. Many of these amygdala patients displayed no inhibitions in gambling and were found to be willing to take huge risks that other people would find completely unacceptable. Thus, even though their IQ is unaffected, amygdala patients have problems to make practical and moral judgments in general, and specifically in the context of risk due to a lack of emotions. These insights allow for a different way of dealing with emotions and public debates about risk than is currently the case. In my research, I argue that rather than being a threat to sound decision-making about risk, emotions are important. The emotions of the public provide insights into reasonable moral considerations that should be taken into account in decisions about risk. Emotions such as sympathy, empathy, and compassion can point out unfair distributions of risks and benefits. Indignation may be an indication of violations of autonomy and cases of risks to which we are exposed against our will. My alternative approach, which I call an emotional deliberation approach to risk, gives the public a genuine voice in which their emotions and concerns are listened to and discussed. My approach can provide us with ideas on how to communicate about risks in a morally responsible way. In debates, experts should not only focus on small probabilities of possible risks, but also provide a balanced outlook on possible positive and negative consequences. This allows people to make a more informed assessment about risks. Furthermore, discussion leaders should invite people to tell narratives and talk about their emotions. Possible questions to trigger such conversations are: what are you afraid of? Under what conditions would you be less worried? Can you understand the viewpoint of the person from the other group? If you were in charge, how would you solve this problem? Such questions can encourage people to express their concerns and values underlying their emotions and to critically reflect upon one's own emotions and those of others by also putting oneself in the shoes of another person. Scientific methods are necessary to provide us with quantitative information about risks, but we also need insight into moral aspects of risks. Here, emotions can play an important role. Focusing on emotions and underlying moral values can provide for more important insights to come to morally better solutions in decision-making about risk. Furthermore, this can help to overcome the gap between experts and the general public that occurs over and over again in debates about risks, as with this alternative approach, the public will feel that their concerns are taken seriously.